January 17, 1940, over the frozen slate skies of northern Germany, a Messerschmitt Bf 109 rolls inverted at 400 kilometers per hour, its Daimler-Benz engine screaming through thin air. Inside the cramped cockpit, Oberleutnant Franz Stigler pulls hard on the stick, initiating a diving turn that sends gravitational forces rippling through his body like an invisible fist. His vision begins to narrow first at the edges, a creeping gray veil that swallows peripheral sight, then deeper, tunneling inward until the instrument panel becomes a distant circle of light surrounded by darkness. His hands still grip the controls. His mind still commands movement, but his eyes betray him. For 3 seconds, perhaps 4, he is flying blind, a condition the Luftwaffe pilots have begun to call Schwarzwerden, the blackening. By the time his vision returns, he has lost 200 meters of altitude and the advantage in the mock dogfight. He radios his wingman with a tight voice, blaming the sun, the angle, anything but the truth they all know but rarely speak. Their bodies are failing them at the edge of combat performance. This was not how it was supposed to be. The men of the Luftwaffe had been told they were the apex of aerial evolution, the product of rigorous selection and superior training. They flew the most advanced fighters in European skies, machines designed by engineers who understood velocity and firepower better than any in the world. Yet in the violent geometry of air combat, where survival depended on outturning, outclimbing, outgliding an opponent, their own physiology had become the limiting factor. Giffer sees the crushing multiplication of gravity. During high-speed maneuvers where the invisible enemy no amount of marksmanship or tactical brilliance could defeat. A pilot could possess the reflexes of a hawk and the courage of a lion. But if his blood drained from his brain during a 6G turn, he became a passenger in his own aircraft. Helpless as the enemy lined up the killing shot, the human body, for all its capacity for endurance and adaptation, was never designed to withstand the accelerations of modern aerial combat. When a pilot pulls into a hard turn, centrifugal force drives blood downward, away from the brain and toward the lower extremities. The heart struggles to pump against this artificial gravity. Within seconds, oxygen starvation begins to shut down the visual cortex, the most energy-demanding tissue in the brain. First comes grayout, a dimming of sight and color. Then tunnel vision. Then complete blackout, though consciousness may remain for a few moments longer. In the worst cases, the pilot loses consciousness entirely. A condition called G-induced loss of consciousness, which in combat is almost always fatal. By early 1940, Luftwaffe flight surgeons had documented dozens of cases of Schwarzwerden among their most experienced pilots. Men who had flown in Spain during the Civil War, who had survived the Polish campaign, who knew their aircraft as intimately as their own hands, these veterans were reporting visual blackouts. During training exercises that barely approached the intensity of real combat, the problem was growing worse as aircraft performance improved. The Bf 109E could sustain tighter turns and steeper dives than its predecessors, which meant pilots were routinely experiencing 5, 6, even 7 Gs in combat maneuvers. The Luftwaffe's advantage in technology was pushing its pilots beyond the physiological limits of human tolerance. Medical officers suggested breathing techniques short, forceful exhalations to increase intrathoracic pressure and slow the drainage of blood from the upper body. They recommended muscle tensing, particularly in the legs and abdomen, to restrict blood pooling. Some pilots tried holding their breath or grunting loudly during high G turns. Instinctive responses that provided marginal benefit. But these were stopgap measures, tricks that might buy an extra second of vision before the blackout came. What the Luftwaffe needed was a systematic solution, a way to mechanically counteract the physiological disaster of high G maneuvering. And they were not the only ones searching for it. Across the Atlantic, in a modest laboratory at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, a young Canadian physiologist named Wilbur Franks was conducting experiments that would change the nature of aerial warfare. Franks had no military background. He was not a pilot. His expertise lay in the mechanics of fluid pressure and the behavior of the human cardiovascular system under stress. In 1939, He had been asked by the Royal Canadian Air Force to investigate the problem of G-induced blackout, which was becoming a serious concern as the British Commonwealth prepared for inevitable conflict with Germany. Franks approached the problem not as an aviator, but as a scientist studying hydraulics. If blood was draining away from the brain due to gravitational force, he reasoned, then the solution was to apply counterpressure to the lower body, preventing the blood from pooling in the legs and abdomen. His first prototype was almost absurdly simple: a rubber bladder filled with water, wrapped around the legs and abdomen of a test subject. When the subject was exposed to increased G-forces in a human centrifuge, a pump would increase the pressure in the bladder, compressing the lower body and mechanically restricting blood flow downward. The concept was sound, but the execution was crude. The early suits leaked, chafed, and restricted movement. Pilots who tested them complained of discomfort and reduced mobility. But the data was undeniable. Subjects wearing the water-filled suit could withstand significantly higher GI forces before experiencing blackout. What had been a physiological barrier was becoming an engineering problem. Franks refined the design. Through 1940 and 1941, working with limited funding and skeptical military reviewers who questioned whether any mechanical garment could solve a problem that seemed fundamentally biological, he replaced the single large bladder with multiple smaller compartments, allowing for more even pressure distribution. He experimented with different fluids, settling on water for its incompressibility and consistency. He adjusted the fit, the materials, the valve systems that regulated pressure. By early 1942, he had a functioning prototype that could be worn beneath a flight suit without significantly impairing a pilot's ability to operate an aircraft. The Franks flying suit, as it came to be known, was ready for operational testing. The Royal Air Force conducted trials in the spring of 1942, using volunteer pilots who flew Spitfires through aggressive combat maneuvers while wearing the experimental suit. The results were extraordinary. Pilots who had previously experienced blackout at 5 Gs could now sustain 6 or 7 Gs without loss of vision. Some reported tolerating brief exposures of 8 Gs accelerations that would have rendered them unconscious without protection. The suit was uncomfortable, certainly. It added weight and bulk. It required careful fitting and maintenance. But it worked. For the first time in the history of powered flight, human physiology was being mechanically augmented to match the performance envelope of the machine. The Americans took immediate interest. By mid-1942, U.S. Army Air Force's medical officers were corresponding with Franks and reviewing the RAF trial data. The United States was ramping up production of high-performance fighters, the P-47 Thunderbolt, the P-51 Mustang aircraft that could outperform nearly anything in the Axis inventory, but which subjected their pilots to crushing G loads in combat. If American pilots could tolerate higher accelerations than their opponents, they would possess an advantage as significant as superior speed or firepower. The USAAF began developing its own version of the anti-G suit, incorporating Franks's principles but adapting the design to American manufacturing capabilities and operational requirements. Meanwhile, across the lines, Luftwaffe pilots continued to fight without any such protection. German aviation medicine was sophisticated in many respects. The Luftwaffe had pioneered research into hypoxia, frostbite, and spatial disorientation, but they had not pursued mechanical solutions to G-tolerance with the same urgency. Perhaps it was institutional conservatism, a reluctance to burden pilots with additional equipment. Perhaps it was resource allocation, as Germany's industrial capacity was increasingly strained by the demands of a multi-front war. Or perhaps it was simply bad luck, the absence of a Wilbur Franks working in a laboratory in Hamburg or Berlin. Whatever the reason, by 1943, Luftwaffe fighter pilots were engaging American adversaries who could pull harder, turn tighter, and sustain combat maneuvers that would have caused a German pilot to black out. The first operational use of anti-G suits by USAAF pilots occurred in late 1943. During bomber escort missions over occupied Europe, P-47 Thunderbolt pilots, wearing the newly issued G-suits beneath their flight gear, found they could engage Luftwaffe interceptors with a newfound aggression. In the chaos of a high-speed dogfight, the ability to sustain even one additional G of force translated into tighter turning radius, faster recovery from dives, and the capacity to remain offensive when an opponent was forced to ease off to avoid blackout. German pilots began reporting encounters with American fighters that seemed to defy the normal limits of air combat. Aircraft that could sustain impossible turns without stalling or losing position. Oberleutnant Franz Stigler, now a veteran of 3 years of air combat, encountered his first G-suit-equipped opponent in the winter of 1944. He was leading a pair of Bf 109 gigaseconds in an attack on a formation of B-17. Mustangs dropped from above, scattering his element. Stigler reversed hard, pulling into a climbing spiral that brought the gray curtain down over his vision. He maintained the turn through memory and instinct, knowing his opponent would expect him to ease off as the blackout deepened. But when his vision cleared, the Mustang was still there, locked in position. The American pilot having matched his turn without apparent difficulty. Stigler broke left, then right, then Davich's maneuver pushing him to the edge of consciousness. The Mustang followed through every evasion. Only a desperate split as into a cloud bank allowed him to escape, and he landed at his base shaken. Not by fear, but by the realization that the rules of engagement had changed in a way he could not counter. In debriefing, he described the encounter to his squadron mates, and they shared similar stories. The Americans were not simply flying better tactics or better aircraft, they were physically outperforming Luftwaffe pilots in sustained high-G maneuvering. Rumors began to circulate that the Allies had developed some kind of pressure suit or medical enhancement. Luftwaffe intelligence officers dismissed these reports as exaggeration or pilot error. But the frontline flyers knew what they had experienced. The physiological advantage they had once taken for granted, the assumption that all pilots were equally limited by human biology, had been overturned. The symbolism of the G-suit extended beyond its tactical utility. It represented a fundamental difference in how the Allied and Axis powers approached the relationship between human and machine. The Luftwaffe, for all its technical sophistication, retained a romantic view of aerial combat as a test of individual skill and willpower. The ace was a heroic figure, a knight of the air whose success depended on innate talent and fighting spirit. To suggest that such a man needed mechanical assistance to perform at his best was almost insulting. An implication that the pilot was insufficient without augmentation. The Americans and British, by contrast, embraced a more pragmatic philosophy. Aerial combat was not a duel, but an engineering problem. If a pilot's body was the weak link in the system, then the body should be reinforced. Just as armor protected the engine and fuel tanks, there was no shame in using technology to overcome biological limits. It was simply good design. This attitude reflected a broader cultural difference. A willingness to treat the human component of war as a machine element that could be optimized, standardized, and improved through systematic research and development. The GI suit became one of many examples of Allied material abundance translating into operational advantage. While German factories struggled to produce sufficient aircraft and fuel, American and British logistics pipelines delivered not just fighters and bombers, but also pressurized oxygen systems, electrically heated flight suits, improved helmets and goggles, survival equipment, and medical innovations like the anti-G suit. Each item individually might seem minor, but collectively they created a cascade of advantages. A pilot who could breathe easily at altitude, stay warm in an unheated cockpit, tolerate high-G maneuvers, and survive a bailout over water was simply more effective than one who could not. And when multiplied across thousands of pilots and tens of thousands of sorties, these small edges compounded into strategic dominance. By 1944, the skies over Europe belonged to the Allies not because their pilots were braver or more skilled than the Luftwaffe, but because they operated within a system that supported them more effectively. The G-suit was a small part of that system, a piece of rubberized fabric and water-filled bladders that kept blood flowing to the brain during the violent ballet of air combat. It was not glamorous. It did not win battles by itself, but it kept pilots conscious, kept them in the fight, and gave them the margin they needed to survive and prevail. Franz Stigler survived the war. one of the dwindling number of Luftwaffe pilots who lived to see the surrender in May 1945. In the years afterward, he would reflect on the encounters of 1944 and 1945, the fights where he had been outmaneuvered not by superior skill, but by superior physiology. He bore no resentment. War was war, and the better-equipped side had won. But he understood that the outcome had been determined not just by tanks and bombers and naval fleets, but by 10,000 smaller decisions, innovations, and investments that collectively gave the Allies an insurmountable edge. The G-suit was one of those decisions. Caused a quiet revolution in a laboratory in Minnesota that changed the physics of survival at 20,000 feet. In the end, the story of the G-suit is not about a single pilot or a single battle. It is about the collision of human ambition and human limitation, and the relentless Allied drive to close the gap between what a man could do and what a machine demanded of him. The Luftwaffe had believed that willpower and training could overcome any obstacle, that the strength of the individual spirit was the ultimate weapon. The Allies understood something deeper, that human beings, for all their courage and skill, are fragile creatures of blood and bone, and that the only way to survive the machinery of modern war was to augment that fragility with science, engineering, and the collective resources of industrial civilization. The blackout that Franz Stigler experienced on that cold January morning in 1940 was the same blackout that would claim the lives of hundreds of Luftwaffe pilots over the next 5 years. It was the body's last defense against forces it was never meant to endure. A physiological surrender in the face of acceleration and gravity. The Allies learned to prevent that surrender, to push the limits of human tolerance just far enough to turn the tide in 10,000 individual combats. And in that incremental advantage, bought with water and rubber and the methodical science of a Canadian physiologist, lay the difference between survival and oblivion, between victory and defeat, between a pilot who saw the enemy in his sights and one who flew blind into the darkness. The G-suit remains in use today, refined and improved, but still built on Wilbur Franks's original insight that the human body is a hydraulic system, and that pressure applied in the right place at the right time can keep a pilot conscious, alive, and fighting. Fighter pilots around the world still pull on the tight, constricting garments before every flight, still feel the squeeze of inflating bladders during high-G maneuvers, still trust that the blood will stay where it belongs and the vision will remain clear. It is a legacy written not in monuments or memorials, but in the quiet continuity of a technology that saved lives then and saves lives now. A testament to the idea that even in the brutality of war, human ingenuity can find ways to protect the fragile vessels that carry us into the sky. And somewhere in that legacy is the memory of a young German pilot pulling hard over frozen fields, his vision narrowing to a pinpoint of light, fighting not just the enemy, but his own body's betrayal, and losing not because he lacked courage or skill, but because the other side had found a way to cheat the limits of flesh and blood, if only for a few precious seconds more.